Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. Hello guys, and welcome back to True Drew Podcast. I hope you guys are enjoying these episodes that we've been doing on the 1970s Nancy Drew / Hardy Boys show. This has been so fun for me to break up all the reading and watch this show because it's honestly been really entertaining. But if you're not as big of a fan of the show and you're like, I want to talk about books again, don't worry. Episode 74, which is a few weeks from now, we will dive right back into the books and I'll be discussing the Triple Hoax mystery. I just thought I would give you all a heads up in case you wanted to locate that book and read along with me, because I know some of you guys like to do that for this podcast. And I haven't actually decided when I'm going to discuss season 2 of the Nancy Drew Hardy Boys 70s TV show. I'll probably, cover some more books in the meantime and then get back to that at a later date. But for now, we're going to be discussing Season 1, Episode number 6, which is called The Secret of the Whispering Walls. So right off the bat, this episode title sounded really familiar to me, The Secret of the Whispering Walls. I mean, there's The Mystery of the Whispering Statue, which is a book. There's also, I think, The Ghost Dogs of Whispering Oaks. I think that's the book that the game Ghost Dogs of Moon Lake is based off of. Of course, that book came out much later than this show. I think it came out in the 90s, so it wouldn't have had any bearing on the plot of this episode anyway. But I don't know, I'm always, when I watch these episodes, trying to pick out what books they base the episode off of. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into some of the direct quotes and notes that I took down for The Secret of the Whispering Walls. So this episode started off with a lot of suspense. We see a guy breaking into the Drews' home and he's snooping in Carson's desk. And then shortly after, Ned pulls up and drops George and Nancy back off at the house after they went to a movie. And so George just leaves, I guess, to give them some time alone. I mean, they're still very much like friends. There's no real big hints that they're even in a relationship in this show so far. So I think that had to have just been George trying to be Ned's wing woman or something. She's like, oh yeah, okay, I'll let you guys have some time alone, because she knows that Ned has a huge crush on Nancy. Whether or not Nancy actually likes Ned back remains to be seen, but anyway. So George goes upstairs and she has no idea that someone else is in the house with her. And Nancy comes in a few minutes later and she hears something, and so she goes to investigate. Now Nancy hears these noises coming from Carson's office, so she kind of creeps closer and she's going, hello, Dad? She's trying to see if he's in his office, and then she spots the thief, and the thief slams the door in Nancy's face. She falls very dramatically to the floor, and then the thief ends up smashing a chair through the window to escape. I guess he was too panicked to exit the house the same way he entered, because I'm pretty sure he just lifted up the sash of the window, but he was like, forget that, I'm just going to take this armchair and just wham through the glass. Now at this point, George has come running downstairs to find Nancy and figure out what's going on, because she heard all these noises, and Nancy says, this guy, he broke into my dad's office and tried to steal some things. And so they're listening and they think the guy's coming back, and so George arms herself with an umbrella. And then when someone sticks their head up on the other side of the window, she whacks them in the head. But it's only Carson Drew. So George feels awful. She's like, oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Drew. Which, I didn't even think about this until this point of recording, but why didn't we get some of George's, mad judo skills in this show? I feel like that would have come in handy and she could have taken down some of the bad guys, because in the books, George is always, judo flipping guys over her knee and stuff. So I don't know why they didn't include that in the show. It would have been pretty awesome. I feel like they could have put some 70s groove track behind it, and George could have been like, oh, hiya! But anyways, George is embarrassed that she hit Carson over the head with an umbrella, and then Nancy explains what happened. So the next thing that I wrote down is Nancy and George get run off the road into the mud by this man on a tractor. And he's a farmer named Mr. Dinko Warner. One thing that I love that they carried over from the Nancy Drew books to this show, some of the characters have the most ridiculous names. But this Dinko Warner guy, he's an absolute peach, and he is just super rude to them. He's like, you should have got out of the way. You know, tractors have the right of way out here in the country. But then he segues from that into saying that Nancy has turned into quite the lady. And I was just like, okay, this is so gross. This has always been so gross to me when an older man says this, because it's like, what are you even insinuating? Also, you can't just run a girl off the road with your tractor and then be like complimenting her in the next breath. But anyways, Mr. Dinko Warner knows Nancy because she's on her way to visit her aunts, and she used to come out there quite a few times when she was younger. And the reason that Nancy and George are going out to visit Nancy's aunts is because one of the things that was stolen from Carson's office by the thief was some paperwork having to do with Aunt Ruby and Aunt Lela selling their farm. It is really neat though, because in this scene we get to see Nancy's blue car. It's not quite the roadster that we see from the 30s, 40s, and 50s, but it's still a blue car, which is really, really cool. So the next thing that I wrote down, which I thought was kind of funny, but Aunt Lela has a coughing tonic, and I said, what makes me think that this is brandy? Because several times during the episode, Aunt Lela will get stressed out about something or complain about her throat, and then she'll be like, I need my coughing tonic. Another thing that I thought was hilarious about this episode, and I made a note of it, but George thinks that garlic charms will ward off ghosts, and I was like, no, George, like that's something else that's also a fictional creature of everyone's imaginations, the vampire. But hey, whatever makes you feel better. If you want to go get garlic knots from Papa John's and string them around your neck, more power to you. But according to the episode, Aunt Ruby and Aunt Lela have been experiencing some haunting-like symptoms at their house, like ghostly things, music, and noises that are unexplainable. And I was so excited when I started glimpsing these parts of the plot, because I was like, they definitely took some inspiration from The Hidden Staircase. It's also pretty funny because Aunt Lela is also talking about the fact that they're going to move to Las Vegas, and she's like, yeah, we're going to go live it up out there. Forget these ghosts. There's a few other characters on the farm, which include Walter and his wife, and they work for Aunt Ruby and Aunt Lela. And Nancy and George, after they've all had dinner and they're getting ready to go to bed, they ask him about the ghosts and what he thinks about it. And Walter's kind of cryptic. He won't really say, he doesn't say that he believes in ghosts or doesn't believe in them either way, but he says, I just wish your aunts hadn't sold, Nancy. I wish they had stayed because they apparently have a lot of bees and they make their money by selling honey. And Walter tells Nancy and George that Aunt Ruby and Aunt Lela were very close to turning a profit. So everybody says goodnight and goes to bed. And then we get a cut scene where we see Carson has twisted his back in a car accident, and he and Ned are at the hospital, which this isn't good because Nancy's aunts had been asking her at dinner, like, hey, when are we going to hear from your dad? Because he was trying to find the missing file for their property. So while Carson is recuperating and eating his Jell-O in the hospital, we see Nancy and George wake up to some loud noises. They hear what they think is singing and music coming from the walls, and George is freaked out. She's like, I want to switch rooms with you, Nancy. So Nancy's like, fine, go in there. And so she gets dressed and goes and starts tapping around the walls in the house and finds a secret passageway in one of the closets. The secret passageway from this episode really reminded me of Ghost of Thornton Hall. If you know, you know, but that game is very, very spooky, and there are many secret passageways. So Nancy's sneaking through this creepy passageway between the walls of the house, and she's got a candle and there's cobwebs everywhere, and she sees someone's shadow and she calls out to them and she's like, who's there? But then before Nancy can chase the person, she slips and falls because she must be in the upper story of the house. And so she's hanging from what looks like pipes or something, but she drops her candle, and all I could think was like, I hope this house doesn't go up in flames. But Nancy loses her grip and falls quite a bit, and she looks like she hurts her wrist a little bit. She's checking her wrist when she falls, and she finds her candle again and is able to relight it with a match, but luckily it blew out. So Nancy follows this creepy passageway until she comes up out of a well, and when she comes out, she sees this flashing light at the top of a house nearby, and then there's a car parked nearby with headlights, and it's flashing back, so they're obviously signaling to each other. And then while Nancy's watching this transpire, she hears a voice say, who's there? And it's Dinko Warner, the farmer from next door. So she's found herself on his property. And Nancy gives him some bogus story like, oh yeah, I was just taking a walk, in the middle of the night, no big deal. But I don't blame her for making something up on the spot because Dinko has a gun and he's just standing there. And she asks him jokingly like, oh, is trespassing a shootable offense? And he's like, yes. So Nancy quickly makes up an excuse like, oh, my aunts are gonna miss me, and she hurries off. And then Dinko's wife comes outside to talk to him and he says, we've got to do something about that meddling girl. So we get some clues from their conversation that they're the ones that want Nancy's aunts to move because they have something to gain from it. So the next note that I have down, Nancy gets back to the farmhouse and George is just decided to sleep in the hallway because she's so scared, and she's like, I'm not sleeping in either of those rooms. But the next morning, Nancy and Ned end up talking on the phone, and Ned says, well, we've had a setback and your dad has ended up in the hospital, but he tells Nancy that a truck actually ran them off the road, and he gives Nancy a license plate number and a brief description of the car. And right before they're about to hang up, Nancy hears a click, and she figures out that someone at the farm was listening in on their conversation. Now, right after this, Aunt Lela comes into the kitchen, I guess to get some more of her coughing tonic, and she's talking to Nancy, and Nancy says, hey, I figured out that there's a passageway and all these weird caverns underneath your house. And Aunt Leila's like, oh yeah, those have been here a while. Like, she knows about it. And she says it was used for smuggling in the 1890s. But never once have Aunt Lela or Aunt Ruby stopped to think like, maybe somebody has figured out a way to get into these caverns and into these passageways, and maybe they're the ones making these noises. But after talking with her aunts for a second, Nancy speculates that it was probably Walter that was listening in on her phone conversation. And the aunts are kind of upset because he forgot to take the trash, so Nancy and George volunteer to do it. So Nancy and George take the trash to a field behind the property where they're supposed to burn it, and Nancy sees some money up in a tree, and so she's like, I guess it does grow on trees. And so her and George are looking at it, and they pocket it to look at it a little bit closer later. As soon as this plot line was introduced, and even when they were talking about the caves underneath the house, I was like, oh, I see what they're going to do. They're going to combine aspects of the Hidden Staircase book and the Secret of Redgate Farm. I bet this money's counterfeit. The next thing that happens in this episode is Nancy and George get back to the farm. They're driving this really cool Jeep, but Nancy sees Walter's truck at the barn, and so she tells George, I'm going to go check it out. And while Nancy's in the barn, she starts kicking around the hay and looking around, and she finds a trap door, which she's pretty sure goes down to those caverns and tunnels that we found earlier. And so Walter sneaks up on her and is like, what are you doing? And she's like, oh, I was just looking for you. And she pulls the $20 bill that she found in the tree earlier, and she says, I know that you work out there where we took the trash to burn it earlier, and I thought this might be yours and that you lost it. And so he kind of looks at the bill and looks at Nancy, and then he's like, yeah, $20 is a lot to lose, thanks. So in the next scene, we see Nancy and George upstairs in their room at the farm, and Nancy is taking these fragments that she found in the burned pile of trash, and she's put them in a solution, and she says it's like nail polish remover and lemon juice and alcohol. And George is like, what is this going to do? And Nancy says, I don't know, but we should probably keep it away from Aunt Lela. And I was like, oh my gosh. But Nancy sees that it's two fragments of two separate dollar bills, but they have the same serial number. So, dun dun dun, we've got some counterfeiters somewhere in the area. So next, Nancy and George go to explore the caverns, and they find evidence of a counterfeiting ring. So the guy who works for the ants, Walter, is in on it, and he sets up this timed bomb because he doesn't want anyone to find evidence of their counterfeiting. So Walter and his wife are guilty, but Dinko Warner is not guilty. He just happens to go down the well because he's like, this is my property and I want to see what's on it, because he realized that Nancy was down in there the other night when he caught her. So he stumbles upon the counterfeiting ring at the worst time because Walter and everybody, they're trying to clear all this money out and get it to Europe, is what they say. And so they tie Dinko up, and Nancy has to untie him and save him. Meanwhile, George goes back up the tunnel and yells for help, and Aunt Lela is enjoying a drink on the couch, and she hears George's voice from the fireplace and freaks out. Luckily, it's right at this moment that Ned comes along, because nobody would have believed Aunt Lela probably, and so he saves the day. The police show up as everyone is coming up out of the well, and unlike in the books, the police actually don't believe Nancy. They don't think that there's a counterfeiting ring, and Walter is trying to convince them that she's lying until this explosion goes off and fake money shoots into the sky. So this episode kind of started and ended with a bang. So some of the funnier quotes from this episode, I mentioned a few earlier, but one is from George, and she says, "We should call the police and have his tractor revoked," when Dinko Warner runs them off the road. And the other funny quote is actually by George as well, and she says, "You have a fetish for not using warm phones?" And so she says this when Nancy says, "Oh, the phone's warm." She's checking to see if someone was using it and listening in on her conversation. And I was like, George, I'm pretty sure you meant phobia, not fetish. So let's talk about some of the things I liked and the things I didn't like about The Secret of the Whispering Walls. So I really liked that this episode felt more like Nancy Drew than the first two episodes. There were secret passageways, there were candles, and hot take, I think that this should have been Nancy Drew's pilot episode. I also said that Aunt Lela sounds like she's a lot of fun. As far as trying to come up with things I didn't like about this episode, I couldn't think of anything. I thought this was a really good episode, and this would have been excellent as the pilot episode. Like, nothing against the one that they picked, but this one just felt more Nancy Drew to me. And as far as books and games that this episode reminded me of, I kind of already mentioned it, but this episode took heavily from The Hidden Staircase and The Secret of Redgate Farm, two books which I really enjoy. When it comes to giving a magnifying glass rating, I gave The Secret of the Whispering Walls 5 magnifying glasses. I think this was a really fun episode. I liked the counterfeit money aspect, the so-called hauntings, and Nancy's aunts were pretty entertaining. So yeah, that concludes today's episode for The Secret of the Whispering Walls. I hope you guys liked it, and I hope you all will tune in for next week's episode where we'll discuss Season 1, Episode 8 of the 1970s Nancy Drew TV show, A Haunting We Will Go. Until next time, thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. Can't get enough of the podcast? Then check out my subscription series, True Drew Files, available on Apple and Spotify. For Nancy Drew books and merchandise, you can check out my website, www.truedrewpodcast.com. For business inquiries, you can contact me at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com, or you can connect with me on Instagram at True Drew Podcast.